On a storm-black night in April 1927, somewhere along a narrow stretch of railway surrounded by miles of floodwater, a locomotive engineer stared at an order that could kill hundreds of people. Stop the train. Ahead of him, the tracks crossed a bridge that inspectors believed might collapse at any moment. Behind him, inside wooden passenger cars, more than 400 refugees, families fleeing the rising waters of the Mississippi, were praying the train would not stop. If he obeyed the order, the flood would trap them. If he disobeyed, the bridge could break beneath the locomotive and send them all into the raging river. The engineer's name was Daniel Harper, and in the next 30 seconds, he would make a decision that history almost forgot. In the autumn of 1889, the town of Greenville sat quietly beside the Mississippi River, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like a pale green ocean. It was not a large town. It did not appear in national newspapers, but to a 7-year-old boy named Daniel Harper, it was the center of the world, because the railroad ran straight through it. Every afternoon at exactly 4:10 p.m., a steam locomotive thundered past the edge of town, pulling freight cars loaded with cotton bales bound for northern factories. Daniel waited for it every day. He would sit on a wooden fence beside the tracks and listen long before he could see it. First came the distant rumble, then the vibration in the rails, then the whistle. To most adults, it was just noise. To Daniel, it was music. Daniel's father, Thomas Harper, worked in the rail yard as a locomotive mechanic. His job was not glamorous. He crawled beneath engines coated in soot and grease, tightening bolts and repairing pistons. But when Daniel watched him work, it looked like magic. Steam engines were complicated machines, hundreds of moving parts, fireboxes roaring like small furnaces, wheels taller than a grown man. One evening, Daniel asked a question his father never forgot. "Do they know where they're going?" Thomas laughed. "Who?" "The trains." His father wiped his hands with a rag. "No, son, they go where the engineer tells them." Daniel thought about that for a moment. "So the engineer decides where the whole train goes?" "That's right." Daniel looked back toward the rails. For the first time in his life, he knew what he wanted to become. By the time Daniel turned 12, the railroad yard had become his second home. The engineers tolerated the curious boy because he asked thoughtful questions and never touched anything without permission. He learned the language of locomotives: throttle, boiler pressure, firebox draft, brake valves. Each sound meant something. The hiss of escaping steam, the deep chugging rhythm of pistons, the metallic tick of cooling iron after a long journey. His father once told him something that would stay with him forever. "Engines talk, Danny." "How?" "They tell you when they're tired, when something's wrong, when they're ready to run." Daniel listened carefully, and slowly he began to understand. The Mississippi River had shaped America long before railroads existed. It carried explorers, it carried trade, and sometimes it carried disaster. People living along the river respected it the way sailors respect the ocean. It was powerful, it was unpredictable, and it had flooded many times before. But by the early 1900s, engineers believed they had solved the problem. Levees had been built, channels had been reinforced, cities expanded confidently along the riverbanks. Many people believed the Mississippi had finally been controlled. They were wrong. In the summer of 1926, heavy storms began sweeping across the Mississippi basin. At first, the rain seemed ordinary. Farmers welcomed it. Rivers rose slightly but remained within their banks, but the storms did not stop. Autumn arrived with more rain. Winter brought even more. By January 1927, the ground across the entire Mississippi Valley was saturated. Fields had become mud. Small streams had become rivers, and the Mississippi itself was swelling beyond anything recorded in living memory. In early April 1927, near Greenville, word spread quickly through town. A levee had failed upstream. At first, people did not panic. Levees failed occasionally. Repairs would be made. But then another levee broke, and another. Soon the river began pouring across farmland like a slow-moving ocean. Entire counties disappeared beneath brown water. Farmhouses became islands. Livestock drowned in their pens. The flood had begun. Railroads suddenly became the only reliable escape route. Roads were submerged. Boats were scarce. But train tracks, raised slightly above the land, still remained above water in many places. Daniel Harper's locomotive was assigned to evacuation duty. His train carried refugees north toward safer cities like Memphis. Every trip looked the same. Crowded cars, families clutching bundles of belongings, children crying softly, old men staring silently out the windows at the flooded land. Each journey felt heavier than the last. By mid-April, the Mississippi floodplain had become one enormous lake. Trees poked from the water like broken spears. Church steeples stood alone above the flood. Railway tracks stretched across the landscape like narrow causeways, and everywhere people waited for rescue. Daniel saw things he would never forget. A horse standing on the roof of a barn, a rowboat tied to the top of a church door, a man waving desperately from a cotton gin surrounded by water. Each image stayed with him. Each trip carried more people, and the water kept rising. The storm clouds that night were so thick the moon disappeared completely. Daniel's train left Greenville shortly after 10 p.m. 400 passengers packed the cars. Women, children, farmers who had lost everything. The locomotive moved slowly along the raised track. On either side stretched miles of floodwater reflecting occasional flashes of lightning. The train looked like a single iron thread crossing a dark sea. Near midnight, a telegraph operator handed Daniel a message from railway headquarters. Stop train until morning inspection. The bridge ahead had been damaged by the current. Crossing it might be dangerous. Daniel read the message again. Behind him, the passengers had no idea what was happening, but Daniel understood the reality. If the train stopped, the rising water would reach the tracks before dawn. The refugees would be stranded, possibly drowned. He looked out into the darkness. The bridge lay somewhere ahead, invisible, uncertain. Daniel turned to his fireman, Joseph Carter. "What do you think?" Joseph hesitated. "Orders are orders." Daniel nodded slowly. But then he looked back toward the passenger cars. Hundreds of lives depended on him. He placed his hand on the throttle and pushed it forward. The locomotive surged ahead. The locomotive's headlamp cut a pale tunnel through the rain. Beyond that circle of light was nothing but darkness and the distant roar of water. Daniel Harper leaned forward in the engineer's seat, eyes locked on the track ahead. The rails glistened with rain. The wooden ties were soaked, and somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend, the bridge waited. Beside him, Joseph Carter shoveled coal into the roaring firebox. The heat inside the locomotive was suffocating, but neither man noticed. They were listening for the subtle changes in sound that told railroad men when danger was near. The rhythm of the wheels changed. The track ahead dipped slightly. Daniel knew what that meant. They were approaching the river crossing. Behind the locomotive, 4 wooden passenger cars swayed gently in the storm. Inside them were people who had lost everything. A farmer named William Carter held his daughter on his lap while his wife stared out the window at the endless floodwater. Across the aisle, an elderly couple whispered prayers. Near the back of the train, a young mother tried to calm two boys who had been crying since they left their flooded home. The passengers didn't know about the telegraph order. They didn't know the bridge might collapse. They simply believed the train was taking them somewhere safe. Outside the windows, lightning flashed across the Mississippi floodplain. Each flash revealed a terrifying sight, a world turned into water. Trees half submerged, barn roofs barely visible above the surface, telephone poles leaning like broken matchsticks. The land had vanished. Only the railroad remained. The sound reached them before the bridge appeared. At first, it was just a low rumble beneath the thunder. Then it grew louder. Not the steady rush of a normal river. This was deeper, violent, like 1,000 waterfalls crashing together. Joseph Carter stopped shoveling coal and looked toward Daniel. "That's the river." Daniel nodded, but he didn't slow the train. The headlamp beam swept across the track ahead, and then the bridge emerged from the darkness. The bridge was a steel truss structure built 20 years earlier. Under normal conditions, it carried trains safely across a modest tributary. But tonight, that tributary had become part of a raging inland sea. Floodwaters slammed against the bridge supports. Debris rushed past in the current. Entire tree trunks spun like spears in the dark water. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Joseph whispered, "That bridge shouldn't be standing." But it was, and 400 lives depended on it. Daniel pulled the whistle cord. The locomotive screamed into the night. It was not a warning, it was a signal, a promise to the passengers behind him that the train would keep moving. Then he eased the throttle forward. The engine rolled onto the bridge. The sound changed instantly. Steel wheels on steel rails echoed through the metal structure. The bridge vibrated beneath the weight. Joseph gripped the edge of the firebox door. Floodwater roared below them, only a few feet beneath the lowest beams. Halfway across the span, lightning exploded across the sky. For one terrible instant, the entire river valley was illuminated. Joseph saw something that froze his blood. A massive tree trunk hurtling straight toward the bridge support. The tree struck the support with a crack that sounded like cannon fire. The entire bridge shuddered violently. Passengers screamed in the cars behind them. Daniel felt the locomotive lurch. For a split second, he thought the bridge was collapsing, but the structure held. The trees spun away in the current. Daniel did not hesitate. He pushed the throttle fully open. Steam roared from the cylinders. The locomotive surged forward like a charging animal. Every bolt in the bridge screamed under the strain. The train raced toward the far end of the span. Then suddenly, the wheels touched solid ground. They had crossed. The train did not stop for miles. Daniel kept the locomotive moving until the floodwaters finally began to recede from the track. When they reached the outskirts of Memphis just before dawn, the passengers slowly stepped off the train. Many of them had no idea how close they had come to death. A farmer approached Daniel and shook his hand. "Thank you for not stopping." Daniel only nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. 2 weeks later, Daniel Harper sat in a small office inside the regional headquarters of the Illinois Central Railroad. 3 company officials sat across the table. One of them read from a document. "You knowingly disobeyed a direct telegraph order to halt your train." Daniel did not argue. "You endangered company property and passenger lives." He remained silent. The officials were not cruel men, but rules were rules. Railroads ran on discipline. After a short deliberation, they delivered their decision. Daniel Harper was dismissed from service. After 20 years on the railroad, his career ended with a single sentence: "You are no longer employed by this company." The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 became the largest river disaster in American history. Nearly 1 million people were displaced. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes. Entire regions remained underwater for months. Newspapers wrote about the destruction. Politicians argued about flood control. Engineers built stronger levees. But almost no one wrote about the train that crossed the bridge that night. Daniel Harper moved to a small town in Arkansas and found work repairing farm equipment. Occasionally, someone recognized his name. Occasionally, someone thanked him. But mostly, life moved on. History is often like that. It remembers disasters. It forgets the quiet acts of courage that prevent them from becoming worse.
The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 changed America. It reshaped flood control, it reshaped politics, and it reshaped the lives of nearly 1 million people. But on one storm-filled night along a narrow railroad bridge, 400 lives were saved because a locomotive engineer refused to stop his train. His name was Daniel Harper, and sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival is simply this: one person choosing to move forward into the darkness.